Commissioners, please.
All right. Is the AARC ready?
So I have to talk for this number to start rolling?
You got it.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Marquise Harris Dawson, and I'm here I'm the president of Community Coalition, which is a community-based organization in South Los Angeles. And I'm also a representative of the African American Redistricting Collaborative. A lot of you have seen a lot of us over the period of hearings, and you've seen our coordinator, Erica Teasley-Lennox, testifying and providing you all with information. And so we're happy to be here to present our formal presentation. We'll have a number of speakers today. There will be some changes in our program based on some events that are happening that I'll talk about later. But today we're joined... Today, I'm here. Erica Teasley-Lennox is here. We also have Professor Kareem Creighton, who I'll say more about later, and then Renina Smith from the Los Angeles Urban League. We're thrilled to be before you today and have a spot at the table and get the opportunity to describe in detail our community of interest. I'm especially appreciated. I came and tried to do it in 3 minutes in L.A., and it didn't quite work out. So today we get to stretch out a little bit. So we're also want to let the commissioners know and let the audience know that we're very grateful to have financial support from both the James Irvine Foundation of California and the California Community Foundation here in Los Angeles. We've also been in communication and collaboration with the Asian American Pacific Legal Center, MALDEF, NALEO Educational Fund, and a host of other organizations throughout the state that care about these issues and care about the rights of people like African Americans and others. We feel like this collaboration and partnership has helped all of us create better products than we would have on our own. And so we were happy to hear from groups this morning and yesterday. We did a lot of work, which we'll talk about, and we have maps and charts that we will show you later. But many times, one of the things we fear, among others, in the African-American community is that our community is looked at as a monolith. Like there's one type of people, one economic class, one kind of background. And there are a host of backgrounds, there's a host of economic classes, and there are a host of histories that are present in the African-American community here in California. We're very grateful for that, and we want to make sure that that gets represented in our government. So for our first speaker, and come on up, Reverend Lee. Reverend Lee, come on up. He's here. Our first speaker will be Erica Teasley-Lennox, and she'll talk about the activities that we've done and how we have carried out our work during this process.
Hi, so it's good to see all of you again. It's been a while since I've testified before you. But I wanted to give you some more background on what we've been doing since last I spoke to you. You may have seen some people that we have reached through our educational workshops come and testify before you. But I wanted to let you know exactly what we've been doing. So we have been working, of course, to make sure that African Americans are involved in this process throughout, from the beginning to the end. When you come out with your maps, we want to make sure that people are there to react to them. And from the beginning as well, we conducted public education workshops. We participated at hearings and through lots of letters I know that you got from us co-signing with APALC and MALDEF and California Forward and Common Cause and other groups. We also have been looking at the issue of prison-based gerrymandering, and we passed out a pamphlet on that that's for later. It has nothing to do with the maps now. But just so that you have that information, there's a bill currently on the legislative floor in the Assembly, AB 420, which deals with this issue of prison-based gerrymandering, and it's a policy issue that we've been concerned about and that we've been working on. We also have, as Marquise mentioned, we've been working with other groups to look at shared interests, commonalities, how we can coalition, and in talking about our communities and things that we have in common and things that may be different as we go through this mapping process. So that's sort of what we've been doing. In terms of who the collaborative is, I guess the last time I talked to you, there were fewer of us who are members of the collaborative, and it has since grown. There are about 30 official members, and then there are other folks that have been to some of our meetings and things, but they haven't officially signed we have like a little piece of paper that you sign off as and check the box. I'm an official member of the collaborative. But some of the new members who are part of the collaborative include the California Black Chamber of Commerce, the Brotherhood Crusade, the California Black Women's Health Project, Congregations Organized for Prophetic Engagement, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Council of Black Political Organizations, the Watts Labor Community Action Council, and others. And so we've been really sort of fortified in our work. We've been able to go around the state and conduct, as I mentioned, the workshops and, okay, I'm just going to let him, I'll bring this over here while you do that. We've been working on our public education activities. We've had forums in South LA, in several places. We've had it in Oakland, we've been in Sacramento, San Bernardino, San Diego, San Francisco, and again, most of the work has been done in South LA, and that's, you'll see the mapping work in South LA. And we've been throughout the parts of South LA, Compton, USC, Village, West Adams, throughout the region, Carson. So one of the things that I think you'll hear from us as we talk about our work and what we've been doing is our focus, again, on communities of interest and the kinds of things that bring folks together, not just racial information, but also economics, access to jobs, healthcare, education, and you're probably going to mention the meeting earlier today, or right now. There's a meeting that concerns our community, and we've been unfortunate that your meetings have been right at the times that we've had really large events. The LA hearing, the public information hearing, input hearing, was during the Urban League dinner, and it's 1,000 people. They go to the Urban League dinner, and lots of people were attending that event, and today I think we'll let Marquise talk about what's going on. But I just wanted to give you sort of a sense of the kind of work we've been doing that's going to inform what you hear today.
Thank you, Erica. So I want to call up from the Los Angeles Urban League, Renita Smith, and from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, Reverend Eric Lee. We think it's very apropos that we have representatives here from two of the organizations that helped win the Voting Rights Act that guides the work that you do today. It's important history, but it's also important to the present-day struggle. Before they come up, I want to just say a few words. We had a few more speakers, not a lot. We weren't going to overwhelm you. But today there's a hearing at the MTA about a train that'll run down Crenshaw Boulevard from Exposition, and it's supposed to go all the way to the airport. This goes right through the very heart of the African-American community in Los Angeles. So the last text message I got said there were about 550 people there, and there were a line of about 30 speakers still ready to speak. So folks would be here, and they asked us to let you know that hearing was happening. Otherwise, they would be here to deal with redistricting. Redistricting lasts for 10 years. We think the train will be here for about 200 years. So people kind of, but it's all very, very important to us. So coming up, we'll go Reverend Lee first, and then Renita.
Thank you. I just left the MTA meeting downtown, and not only was the main room filled to capacity, there was overflow, 2 overflow rooms in which people were seeking to voice their concerns about what's going on in the community. As Marquise indicated, and Erica, I'm the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Los Angeles, and the California state president. It is the only organization founded by the Dr. Martin Luther King on the principles of justice and equality. The SCLC, as a civil rights organization, has since its inception fought for inclusion of all people who have been marginalized, disenfranchised, oppressed, discriminated against. And it was regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, justice for all people, because Dr. King believed in a beloved community. And in our communities, which strongly African American, but you see some demographic changes taking place, we share the same neighborhoods. We share the same resources, the schools, the public services. and the same dreams and hopes for a better generation, for a brighter future for our children. One case in point is the immigration reform issue. And I would say that it's going to take an effort between your traditional and historical civil rights agencies to advocate and, I believe, win immigration reform so that our communities are stabilized. But it speaks to the need for remembering and embracing the historical context and the legacy of African Americans fighting for rights for all people. And so even as the demographics are changing, the history and the tradition of our organization and others has been to make sure that equality is the fundamental baseline for which we all exist. And so it is our hope that in any redistricting decisions, that historical context is used in your decision-making process. Because there are intersecting points of justice and equality that, quite frankly, African Americans have been dealing with since our time in this country. And we are moving towards a point of not pursuing the individual civil rights of one particular community, but the universal human rights of all communities. And so redistricting will have a tremendous impact on that. Because I see that, I'm a preacher, by the way. And I saw that I had you raptured, so I was going to keep it. So let me say this. On behalf of the residents of Southern California, of South Los Angeles and the surrounding areas, we hope that you will look at increasing the district boundaries so that we may continue to maintain the representation of our elected leaders as well as continue to represent the constituencies in which we serve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Amen. Now I want to bring up Renita Smith. The Los Angeles Urban League does a study every 5 years called the State of Black Los Angeles, which looks at Los Angeles County, the conditions of African Americans, but really focuses in on the neighborhoods and communities of interest that we will talk about for the remaining part of our discussion. I believe that you all have a copy of the report, and Renita will come and give some highlights from it.
Thank you, Marquise. Good morning. It's an honor to be able to speak with you today and to join my fellow colleagues in this work that we're trying to do to transform and uplift African American communities. And I wanted to give you a taste of the State of Black Los Angeles report, of which you do have a copy. And just basically, so you have a copy of this, and I believe we also have handouts of some of the specific pages that we'd like to highlight. But in essence, what this report is a presentation of the analysis derived from the Racial Equality Index. The Racial Equality Index is a quantitative tool that measures the well-being of African Americans versus every other race in Los Angeles. So it basically distills into a single number, a single composite number, variables for health, housing, education, employment, civic engagement, and public safety. And it brings it down into one number so that we can see where we stand relative to other races. And what our most recent report shows, which was just released in April 2011, it's released every 5 years, and it's a follow-up from the 2005 report. It shows that African Americans are overall at a 0.71. In other words, our outcomes across education, housing, safety, et cetera, are about 70% of those of white Angelenos. And we chose white Angelenos as the benchmark, the sort of 1.0, because they outperform the other ethnic groups on most measures. There are a few on which Asian Americans outperform the white Angelenos. But it's a very telling number for us. It speaks to the work that has to be done. The good news is that number did increase 3 index points from 5 years ago. So we went from being 68% of white Angeleno outcomes to 71%. At that rate of change, though, it could take more than half a century to close the gap, and we are committed, along with the organizations represented here and many others, to closing that gap and increasing the rate at which we close it. The political support that we have had to date has been instrumental in us making the gains that we have had. It's been the support that we've had at the local, state, and federal level that have enabled African Americans to show progress in racial equality and demonstrate that although racial equalities exist, they're not so ingrained that they cannot change. So I just make an appeal to you. I thank you for your service in looking at the very thorny redistricting issues, and I ask you to keep in mind that 0.68 to 0.71 and our hope to increase it far beyond. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I want to acknowledge that Pastor William Monroe Campbell is here, also to support the work of the collaborative, and he has testified before you before, I think, at the Los Angeles hearing. We want to talk about the process by which we drew our maps and the adherence to the redistricting criteria. So, of course, we looked at the equal population of districts and the one person, one vote, and have very low deviations. We have, of course, complied with the Federal Voting Rights Act in the looking at districts. They're contiguous. There's the respect for communities of interest, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. We wanted to kind of bring out some of the community of interest information from our community through the testimony that you heard earlier. The districts are compact. They're also nested within the Senate districts. And we've incorporated public testimony and our community partners' comments with regard to their communities and how our communities intersect. We started by identifying communities of interest and in talking to folks who are part of the communities that we care about. And looking at South Los Angeles, we also looked at the East Bay area and at Sacramento, the Inland Empire. And you heard earlier from Walter Hawkins, who's with the Inland Empire African American Redistricting Coalition and WAG. And through these meetings, we heard from folks about what they think their communities are, neighborhoods that should be in their assembly districts or their Senate districts, and ones that they think don't make sense. We heard from folks in Carson talking about how their Senate district also takes right now currently into account Rancho Palos Verdes. And they really don't think they have anything in common with those folks, but that's the way the district is at this point. And so we've heard from people from Carson and Compton and USC Village and Bayview Hunters Point and Exposition Park and all throughout South LA and other parts of the state where we have larger concentrations of African Americans. And we kind of listened to what they thought of their neighborhoods, how they thought they were performing politically, whether they were active and civically engaged, how they thought their access to jobs was, their access to health care, to education. There have been, with the decline in education and funding, there have been lots of protests in South LA with regard to that. And so that is definitely an issue that has brought people together, people of all races, and definitely people in South Los Angeles where the schools are not operating as they should. And you'll see that in the Urban League report as well. So similar to the commission, we agree and definitely understand that community members know best about what communities they should be a part of and what it is that's really the quality and nature of their community. And there aren't folks that can come in and say, okay, well, this is what, we're going to draw the district like this because this is how we see your community. And that we really need to take into account the information that comes from the community. So that was really key. We also listened to the testimony of others that you also had heard and have tried to keep abreast of all the testimony that's been coming in and read some of the written comments as well and take that into account when looking at the mapping. We also, as has been mentioned, have been working with our community partners and others who've been funded by the Irvine Foundation to talk to them about what they're seeing. It was great to see APALC's presentation today, which was very impressive, and they've been doing so much work over a long period of time, and I really want to applaud the work that they've been doing. And they have been very inclusive and very, forthright with what they're working on, how their communities are talking about how they interact with other communities, and we've been having conversations about South LA, about San Diego, and other areas where our communities live very close together, as well as with the Latino community. So I want to make the point that we have been sharing information and working very closely. We've been sort of behind in providing information to other organizations because we were a little bit behind in our process and started our community meetings late and started getting that community of interest testimony a little later than others. But we definitely are here and want to talk about what our maps look like currently. So I think, this was community of interest overview, but you'll have this as part of the presentation. I want to then, because we talked about the Voting Rights Act I want to introduce someone who's been working with us in developing our plans and in looking at how the African American community is engaged politically, how we have been able to elect candidates of choice throughout time at populations that have really been under 50% in the past and currently. And so he's going to talk about adherence to the Voting Rights Act and other things. It's Professor Kareem Creighton. He is a political scientist professor and also a law professor, and he's currently at UNC. He was at USC. And if any of you have played the Redistricting game, he was the creator of that through his political science work. So I want to bring up Professor Creighton.
Thank you, Erica. And good morning. I am going to try to limit my comments to about 3 to 5 minutes, but invite you to answer or ask me more questions if you desire. There's a lot more material in the report, but I do want to express a point about the Voting Rights Act and how it applies in South LA, because I imagine a good number of you will be thinking hard about how to use this space in the neighborhoods and design them into districts. It's important to recognize that, as Erica pointed out, this is a site of the most significant political participation among African Americans in this state. It is the most populous city in the state, and I'd say it is South LA an anchor, electorally and also in terms of culture, for making LA what it is. For that reason, though, it's important to recognize what the Voting Rights Act requires and what it doesn't require in a district map that it treats South LA after 2010. As you know, the demographic trends for African Americans don't reflect the same kind of robust growth of Asian American, Pacific Islander communities or Latino communities, but it nevertheless has remained fairly stable. And more important, it has remained fairly concentrated in, among other places, South LA, which was one of the reasons that the collaborative wanted to focus on this area. It's also important to recognize that one of the elements that defines this region is the fact that they've been fairly successful, in fact quite consistently so, in electing preferred candidates in contexts where African Americans are less than a majority of the citizen voting age population. That's quite distinct throughout the country. Most places in the traditional voting rights context have required majorities of African Americans, or for that matter, other non-white groups, in order to elect a candidate of choice. For various historical reasons, which I won't go into just now, that's not necessarily been the case in California, in particular in Southern California. If you look at the congressional districts, the assembly districts, and the state senate districts, all of them have consistently elected preferred candidates of the African American community who at the same time are responding to the interests of other communities who are located within those districts, but they've done that in a context where African Americans are not a majority. What does that mean in practice? I think it means a few things, and I hope you all take this into account as you consider how the Voting Rights Act interacts with the other elements of the state law that you all are grappling with. The first is that I believe that Section 5 actually has some bearing on how you understand what changes will be adopted in this part of the state. I recognize that indeed California is only covered in certain numbers of counties, not in Southern California, and it is subject to pre-clearance review in those respects. But it is also important to recognize that the standard that Section 5 requires the state to show that it does not retrogress is not necessarily limited to the geographic space in which Section 5 coverage applies. Therefore, it is important to at least bear in mind that the effect on the exercise of the political franchise, that's the language from the Act, is at least held constant throughout the state with respect to all potentially protected groups. So I think in that respect, at least in the background, one should bear in mind that the status of South LA is significant. The second element I think that is important to keep in mind with respect to the Voting Rights Act is the ability of African Americans to actually exercise their franchise successfully. That is, to successfully elect candidates of choice in contexts less than a majority. There may be some who would argue that there is a need to reshape South LA in a manner that creates a majority of African Americans in a few consolidated districts. We want to reject that. Although we agree that Section 2 should be utilized in places where there is significant racially polarized voting, we don't have that same presence of racially polarized voting in South LA to the extent that it denies African Americans the ability to elect candidates of choice. More important, we think that our maps show that you can create districts that satisfy the equal population standard, but that also maintain the cores of these existing districts in South LA without offending the clear interest of Latinos to the east of the 110 to have CVAP districts, citizen voting age populations, in which they may form a majority. We want to leave those options open to the Commission to consider how to treat the areas to the east of the 110. But it's important to recognize that with respect to the South LA core districts, they work, they're effective, and they don't necessarily require creating a majority. Indeed, if a majority is created against the wishes that have been expressed by the African American community, it seems to me that that would open up the possibility of a Section 2 lawsuit having to do with packing, the overconcentration of voters within a single space. Finally, with respect to the state law, obviously the Proposition 11, once adopted, created a mandate to recognize communities of interest in districts that are created. We think, for all of the reasons that have been stated before, in much more eloquent terms than I can tell you, that African Americans in South LA do represent significant communities of interest. They form the cores of districts that have been important culturally, not just to the people who are located there, but people who live, African Americans in particular, who live outside of the districts. Just a short story, I lived in central LA during the time I was a resident and often went to Crenshaw for the purpose of doing basic things like getting one's hair cut. This is true, I think, throughout the city. It serves as a cultural hub, and people are linked, regardless of class and socioeconomic status, by that cultural heritage. And so it's important, I think, to consider that, but also the political effectiveness of these organizations that are located in South LA to successfully elect candidates of choice. So whether you look at this under federal law with respect to the Voting Rights Act or state law with respect to the consideration of communities of interest, it seems to me that the existing cores of districts that sit in South LA, both with respect to the Assembly, Senate districts, and congressional districts, ought to be, to the extent possible, preserved. And we think that our plans offer you a very clear option of how to do that.
So thank you so much. So you all have copies of the maps. You can see the ones that we want to focus our discussion on: Assembly districts 47, 48, 51, and 52, and Senate districts 25 and 26. And here is a map of our state assembly map, which has those districts outlined that you can see. It again maintains the core and has integrity to the existing districts, with some modifications to deal with changes in population. But you can see in the northwest part of South LA, we have the communities of View Park, Windsor Hills, a little bit of Mid-City, and a little bit of what's still referred to as South LA. In the southeast corner, we have a district anchored by Inglewood and Gardena, but also includes Hawthorne and Lenox. And then on the east side of South LA, we have the communities of South Central, or what's traditionally referred to as South Central, Westmont, and Walnut Park. And you can see that that district goes pretty far east. That's one of the significant changes, is that district drifts a little bit eastward. And then in the southeast, we have a district anchored by Compton and Lakewood, and including a host of a few other communities.
Did you have hard copies of that floating around?
You should have hard copies in your hand. Some of you do. Not all of us.
Janice had passed it out and said that it was first presenter, but it's actually this presentation. It's a small packet that was attached with a paper. It says first presenter at the top.
So this clock is running down. These are the deviations here that you have. I'll skip ahead to the congressional districts. Again, these three congressional districts, again, are very similar to ones that are currently in place. They cover roughly the same areas, our Assembly and Senate districts, and you can see the lines there. District 33 in the northwest section, 35 in the southwest, and 37, which goes down and includes African-American communities in Long Beach, Compton, West Adams, and the southeast part of the city. Should I include anything else? We got 90 seconds. So just a little bit about these communities. These are districts that each have, both on the Assembly side and the Assembly and Senate side, and on the congressional side, these are districts that are connected to the civil rights struggle here in the state of California and indeed the United States. They've historically, again, since the time of the civil rights movement, been represented by African Americans, even though, as Professor Creighton in such a detailed and articulate way pointed out, these are not majority African American districts. They're districts where the African American population may be in between 30 and 45%. But because of the common experience of folks and because of the political activism that I think Urban League documents so well in their report, these districts are able to elect candidates of their choice, and candidates that can speak not only to the needs of African Americans but the other groups that live in these areas. So that concludes our report. I just want to make a couple introductions. From Christ Liberation Center, we have Reverend William Smart here. I want him to wave his hand. He joined us today, and Reverend William Monroe Campbell as well, who joined us, ran over here from the MTA hearing. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much. Commissioners, questions? Commissioner Forbes, Blanco.
Yes, thank you. I'm referring to your congressional plan map, and I'm looking at the cities outside the district, actually the Manhattan Beach, Redondo Beach, Torrance. Do you have any idea what that population is? And the reason I'm asking is that area of the peninsula basically being isolated by number 35?
Yeah, so we got, the area is significantly different. It's a coastal community, and whereas the parts that we include are inland communities. But we also took note of pretty vociferous testimony at the Los Angeles hearing about people from Manhattan Beach, Hermosa Beach, about not wanting to be in that district in 35. And so those were among the many things that we considered.
Right, but do you know what the population is that you left there by any chance?
What about them?
What the total population
is. The number of people. I don't know the number.
The reason I ask is that I'm concerned that, and it may just be the way I'm reading the map, that you're basically going to have, to create another congressional district along the coast, you're going to basically have to run along the beach for a period of time. And those are the kinds of gerrymandered things that people have raised their eyebrows to. When the tide comes in, the district is cut in half. And that's my concern.
Again, just to some of the feedback that we got was that people live along the coast consider themselves a community of interest, precisely because if a tide comes, they're in more trouble than the rest of us.
Thank you. Commissioner Blanco.
Before I ask a question, I just want to follow our practice of disclosure, and that's that, as I've mentioned before, I know Ms. Teasley, and I've met the professor as well. And also, I just wanted to make clear that in the thanks to the California Community Foundation for funding the redistricting work, that grant was made before I arrived at the California Community Foundation. And in fact, I've recused myself from anything having to do with redistricting at the California Community Foundation. So I just want to say that starting. So I'm trying to, I understand what's going on here, I think. And so I have two questions. Would it be, this is for the professor, would it be in your view packing if we created a majority minority district based, and also to what extent is the ability to elect in these districts due to the fact that there's a very low CVAP Latino population?
I want to make sure that I understand your question. When you say create a majority-minority district, does that mean
No, African American.
Majority African American.
Right. In other words, you see our dilemma where we are able, and we may be mandated to draw a majority minority African American district if the numbers are there, and the presentation is don't do that. We rather have 20 to 30% in various assembly districts because we believe that African Americans can continue to get elected even though they're not. We haven't drawn a traditional voting rights district, but that puts us. So I'm saying, do you believe legally we would be at risk for having packed if we drew something that was a majority-minority district?
Well, there are two thoughts here. First, I think the important distinction in this context, as compared to others, is that we have a demonstrated record of electing candidates of choice. Most of the cases that raise Section 2 problems, either in the context of packing or cracking, right, involve a situation in which you don't have it and you have a presence of significant racially polarized voting. I don't think that either of those is present here. We have a proven track record of electing candidates of choice, and in most elections, we don't have the presence of severely racially polarized voting. And to the extent that you can actually pursue the interest of preserving these districts while also creating what I do think is absolutely clear for Latinos to the east of the 110 to create some number of majority Latino districts, it seems to me that one can pursue both of those interests without offending either group's interest with respect to the Voting Rights Act. So to answer your question, though, about whether it would necessarily become packing by putting African Americans in, there is no clarity in the law at the moment as to whether that happens. But I can see an argument in a lawsuit if one is not very careful about doing that with the support of the community that's being reorganized. It seems to me that where a community is electing in a context a significant number of candidates that they prefer to office, it would be troubling without some very substantial reasoning behind it, and hopefully also the support of the community that's affected to reorganize that community in a way that elects fewer candidates than before.
Commissioner Parvenu.
It's a matter of disclosure. I know nearly everyone here that's speaking, so I just wanted to say that.
The important thing is
just
we know you.
The professor.
We won't hold that against them.
I just want to say I appreciate your historical context and how you placed so wonderfully placed the history behind the organizations that have brought the Voting Rights Act into existence in the first place. With the, I don't have a Senate map, but my assumption is that with the Senate map, the nesting would occur with.
Yeah, we would nest along the west and on the east. So 40 north and south. So 47 and 48, and then 51 and 52.
All right, and the deviations for the congressional districts is to the person. So there's -1 right to the person, of course, and the other deviations here are percentages. Percentages, for example, 27.8, just clarify for me, please. 27.8, the various percentages you have there. Okay. All right. I didn't see that page. Anyway, I just wanted to say thank you for your good work. And there are many occasions I want to disclose to the Commission there were many occasions that I was not able to conduct the outreach to the extent that I could possibly do because of the work with the Commission. And I just want to publicly acknowledge you all for doing the great work you've done. So thanks for your presentation.
Commissioner Anchetta.
Thank you. Good morning. And first, let me apologize ahead of time because I do have to take a conference call, which might require me to walk out. I think I still have a day job, and I have to be on a call around noontime. But thank you. And again, I do know a couple of people, and Professor Creighton. I think we last talked at the Indianapolis airport last year when I was still applying for the commission, and you were still at SC. But congratulations on your new position. And actually, this is a question for Professor Creighton. A little bit of a follow-up on Commissioner Blanco's question. We can certainly use the communities of interest criterion to encompass these proposed districts. I think that's fairly clear. I'm wondering just if the Voting Rights Act cause of action that might be asserted is either because and we know because of Bartlett there are limits on certain kinds of claims, but that's a disagreement that exists among many people in terms of causes of action. But at least in terms of other causes of action, is there any assertion within these proposed plans regarding either an ability to influence claim under Section 2 or some sort of coalitional claim, in other words, multiple minority claim?
Thank you for the question, and it is good to see you again outside of an airport. Indeed, I do think there are variants of a Section 2 claim that are as yet untested. And I now live in North Carolina, a place that has gotten very used to testing Supreme Court law when it comes to elections and voting. And if California wishes to become part of that small club, there are ways of doing that. I'd like to give you opportunities not to. But I do think that if one is to file a Section 2 lawsuit based on a challenge of, let's say, a less than fortunate treatment of South LA, there are definitely both of those options, I think, available. The court has, as of yet, not settled the question as to whether or not coalitions form the basis of a valid group, particularly coalitions of non-white persons. It's important to note, because you point out rightly that Bartlett seemed to foreclose the ability of African Americans in the state of North Carolina to form some sort of coalition with whites for the purposes of Section 2 protections. But there is, as of yet, not much clarity in the law as to whether or not non-white groups who together vote alike have some shared interest and could, if put together, meet the arithmetic requirements of Section 2. That actually, I think, is a viable option. And then second, as you point out, as far as influence is concerned, there is a little bit of scattered district court law about influence, perhaps in some contexts meeting the standard for Section 2. And I think, at least here, there are enough of distinct elements in the way that politics work in South LA and in California more generally to suggest that African Americans put together with groups that they normally cooperate with might be able to make a viable claim that the existing districts that they have, as opposed to abstract districts that might be created, are worth protecting under the auspices of Section 2. And again, this is not entirely settled law, but it certainly would be the kind of case that someone might file if South LA is not treated in a manner I think that the community would prefer.
Commissioner DiGiulio.
In the back. I apologize to you, by the way, for being a little bit late. Despite getting up at 4 this morning, the airlines and I didn't agree on getting here on time. But I do have a question. I'm similar to Commissioner Forbes' question. I noticed first on the congressional. I'm just wondering how much you've looked at some of the areas surrounding the proposed districts. And particularly, I'm looking in the southern part of 37, where you're very close to the Orange-LA County border and some of the areas north of that. We've heard a lot of testimony that has said that that's really a clear demarcation for a lot of communities of interest. So if we were to take, again, if we were to look at the very thorough job that you've done and try and marry that with some of the other community of interest testimony and issues, how that would affect your districts, your proposed districts. Because again, if we were to try and keep the integrity of some of those, like keeping that as a hard line, then that would result in a district that might kind of go up and snake around. Or we've had some different testimony about Long Beach and how much we should keep it together. So I'm just curious, kind of in that whole context, and I noticed that a little bit as well on the assembly in the southern part of Long Beach, how much you've looked at surrounding areas and how that will impact your proposed districts.
Well, I just speaking more less on the technical side and the map drawing side and more on the community outreach side, we also got a lot of feedback from Long Beach in the southeast part of the county of Los Angeles, and people said exactly what you're saying. Just because we live in Long Beach doesn't mean there aren't sections of Long Beach, or Long Beach doesn't have segregation like any other part of the country would or city would. And so we've definitely heard and seen proposals that do the 37th in particular in different ways, and still preserve the numerical goals we were trying to achieve. We've definitely seen that, and we've looked at it. We settled on this for a variety of reasons, but we definitely heard that and took it into account when we drew this map.
We've also heard from folks from Long Beach about the history of Long Beach, and Long Beach used to have at-large city elections, and when it did, only whites were elected. And when it went to district, then people of color were finally brought into the process. So people kind of talk about that history of Long Beach, and so Long Beach whole gives certain people a certain feeling, and Long Beach divided is okay for folks who, we had a meeting in Compton last Saturday, and they were talking about what they thought their district should look like, and they said definitely that Compton, Carson, and North Long Beach are a community of interest. That's sort of, they think of themselves as being together in the 710 and the transportation corridors and sort of how they shop and live. And so I think that's the other response about Long Beach. There's that history.
And I can understand, and I think that's a very legitimate, we've heard that in some of our testimony. I just was curious as to whether you've actually run any other districts besides these three to see how they fit into their proposal, kind of, the larger regional, because as you know, we have to fit this into a framework of a very large and taking in the testimony of a lot of other areas and how, because a little push here pushes a little bit more there. So I didn't know if you had actually run any numbers or had some other proposed districts surrounding these to kind of give them some more legitimacy to say, these areas we've been able to honor their communities of interest testimony, and therefore it would only enhance ours, or we'll hear some conflicts, but this is how we resolve it in order to keep the integrity of our district. So I didn't know if you'd played around with that or like to comment on it.
We definitely have. I mean, we've played around with just about every portion of South LA where there are larger concentrations of African Americans and where folks have said that they feel that their community of interest needs to be respected in a certain way. And so we have looked at other things, but with the congressional lines, you have to have that, equal population is so key, and you're also trying not to split communities, insofar as you can keep them together, and again, talking about Palos Verdes and Palos Verdes Estates and sort of the coastal communities, Manhattan Beach, and there's that into keeping the integrity of the coastal communities and sort of a wealthier. They have a different perspective than the Compton folks, and so there are all those different issues. So trying to put together the communities of interest arguments and hearing the testimony from folks, and then also looking at the deviations and trying not to split communities. This is our best effort.
Thank you.
Commissioner Getty.
Yes, perhaps a question for Professor Creighton. Up and down the state, we've received comments from the public related to an admonishment to not use race and ethnicity in drawing districts. So I understand that the VRA, of course, figures into this topic, but perhaps you could say a few words about how race and ethnicity relates to redistricting itself.
Sure. I can say two things, but if I can just sort of offer just a supplemental response to the exchange just before. One of the reasons that this plan was adopted in the frame that it was to at least permit a lot of functionality around the areas. There are a lot of different ways that one can handle the other areas around these districts, and what we tried to do was minimize what we thought was a very clear way of representing the interests of our community without getting into debates that obviously other people are going to bring to you. But I think it's a relevant question, but I think this is modular enough to fit in a lot of contexts. To answer the question about race, though, I think it's very difficult to understand why we have redistricting without having some attention to the role that race plays, just as a historical matter. The way in which the constitutional attention became sort of interested in the equal power designated to any given district had in part to do with just populations, but it had something also to do with race. And once the Voting Rights Act became part of law, it became abundantly clear that political power in this country has in many ways been denied to large segments of the population, and it's been basically embedded in institutions. When you, for a long period of time, do not take account of people who are significant portions of the population, it has an effect on policy, it has an effect on the way lines are drawn. But to get more technical, because I want to make sure that I'm responsive to what I'm hearing are concerns that have been expressed in hearings, it is a mandate of federal law to take account of the way in which racial minorities who have had a history of being marginalized in these processes, how they are treated in decisions that reallocate political power. The commission may well want to address a lot of other issues, and that's important, but federal law requires that as a primary matter. And I think there's a long historical narrative for why that is so, but it seems to me that in a state as diverse as California, as rich in its sort of differences and commonalities in some interesting ways, it's important to recognize that people do have distinct interests, and those interests sometimes coalesce, sometimes they collide, but it is not necessarily an easy process, right? But at the same time, it's still important, I think, to reflect as much as one can the balance of interests that people have. And those, and it's, I guess it's the other thing to say is that this isn't just talking about race for the purpose of race. I think we all agree that isolating someone because of the color of their skin is troubling. But what we're talking about in this context is race as it builds into, as it serves as a proxy for things that we all care about, where people live, where people go to church, where people shop, what kind of work people do. in our history, troubled though it is, we have a history of treating people partly in similar ways based upon their race or group identity. That can have its negative aspects, but it can also have its positive aspects too. Witness any number of parades we have around the city celebrating any number of identities. What we are trying to do in redistricting as a whole is to reflect those distinctions. And it's my hope, at least, that the Commission take all of those factors into account.
We have one more question for Commissioner Columbus-Boy.
Also, in the interest of disclosure, I do know Mr. Harris Dawson have for some time. My question is in regards to the level of collaboration or coordination across the different groups that we're seeing here today that are coming, essentially focusing in on specific ethnic or racial communities, and wondering to what extent, again, I have maps that at some point will be right next to each other, and I assume we'll be able to overlay them. But to what extent you feel that your maps that you're presenting across the different groups today have been internally reconciled? In other words, are there specific areas that you would want to point to the Commission where the compromise was not so clear across the groups, or where you've simply agreed to disagree?
Oh, saved by the bell. I don't know why this isn't backing up, because I want to get to the assembly. Oh, there. So, good question. We've all been working together through this, from, I guess, the first meeting where official meeting was the day before Thanksgiving. We met at APALC's offices, and there were groups there, all the civil rights organizations and folks who care about access for people of color in this process. And we talked, and we had been calling it the inter-ethnic dialogue, and we were sending around emails, we've got to schedule our meetings, and we need to talk, we need to sort of identify what issues we think will be coming up, and how what will be the sticky points, and what will be areas where we can coalesce and try to figure out how we can, build communities of interest together and not have conflict when drawing the lines. So that was sort of the first official face-to-face meeting was the day before Thanksgiving. And so fast forward to today, we've had lots of conversations. You've seen sort of the collaboration of our work in letters that we send to you on the different issues, from your hiring of your Voting Rights Act counsel to public input processes and how many public hearings there should be and all those things. And in talking about where our communities are, and there are certain areas of the state, and we're going to be presenting larger plans. There's areas like San Diego, where I know when I did my meeting in San Diego, the folks were talking about the African American folks who came to the meeting. It was mostly attended by African Americans. There were some whites and some Asians, but they talked about how much concern they had for the API community in different areas. And they said, well, economically, on this side of San Diego, this is like a wealthier, Chinese population over here. There's like Hmong and other Laotian, different populations, and they really were working together. A lot of what's happening in San Diego, though, on the local level, is really bringing them together because of how they're doing their local redistricting, and they're getting an extra seat, and so they're really working to try and create more opportunities for voters of color. And so there are areas where there has been really positive collaboration and sort of talking about what's going on. It is, in South LA, there are areas that I know our colleagues from APALC have different opinions about what should happen in terms of Gardena and Torrance, and they'd like to keep those parts together because of the API communities there. And in having discussions with about, we've mentioned the east side, like sort of east of the 110, that the Latino community has concerns there. And I think there are some places where we're not going to be able to work it out. We tried in the northern portion where Koreatown is. It's the yellow, I don't have a pointer, but all the way up to the top. Koreatown is up there, and we really tried our best to preserve the section, the Olympic section. We tried to not split it in the 4 different, there was testimony about how it had been split in 4 different assembly districts, and now there's a tiny bit that's in 47, but we tried to respect that area there. So I think, there has been, discussions and give and take, and people have been sharing their ideas, and we've tried as best we can, and we're all still very collegial, and we hang out, and but it's difficult. It's a very diverse city, and we've been trying to strike that balance.
I think a lot of work has been done, and everybody approached it with a good spirit. The way I would characterize the differences is the folks who both testified and the members of the African American Redistricting Collaborative, when we looked at it, we identified the communities of interest as a strategy to maintain the representation that currently exists. And so we wanted to, our charge was to pursue a strategy that made that happen. And so other collaboratives had different charges, and so that's where you'll see the overlap. But again, the communication and collegiality has been there all the while. And there are other iterations or other maps that exist that some of them take into account the objectives we were trying to achieve.
We have a little more time in our schedule, so Commissioner Forbes, I think you had another question.
See if I can recall my question. Thank you. If we don't necessarily use your lines and feel like we need to move them around somewhat, like Gore to Orange, I know you'd be very hurt. But is a principle that I can take from the line drawing or your line drawing is that if we are able to achieve a African American CVAP of in the vicinity of 35% for what we end up doing, does that seem to be consistent with what I'm reading here? I mean, the numbers you have, like for congressional, 27 to 42, for assembly are from 33 to 47%. I'm just trying to come up with a standard that we can apply that might not, if in fact we don't use exactly the lines you've offered us.
I think the important thing to recognize is that in terms of its track record, the districts that have performed well have fallen in that range. However, it's important in our maps that we have preserved the core of each of these districts. So we, in terms of assessing a plan, will not just look at the percentages that are achieved, but where those districts are located and the number of districts that is ultimately created. So as we suggested, on the margins, this plan can fit within a lot of different contexts, and obviously there will be nips and tucks done, but I don't think saying a particular number is the threshold for any district is going to be something that is a commitment that will cover all cases. But I think in general, it's fair to say that things that have been successful in this part of the state, in this particular configuration, have fallen roughly in that range.
I have a...
Yeah, and I would just add to that, folks might remember I started that by saying that sometimes people look at the African American community as a monolith, and there are lots of there are lots of differences within the community, and our maps kind of try to get at that, and that remains important.
Okay, I have a quick question for the Commission. We've got 25 minutes before the scheduled lunch, and we have a group that had requested to apply, and they think they might be able to make their presentation in that short period. Would you be willing to add that in? Okay, with that, Christina, would you want to bring the group in?
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you very much. That was a very thoughtful presentation. I've been informed that eating is not allowed in this facility, so if anybody can't wait, they'll have to go eat outside.